Hi, welcome to Actual Spinster. My name is Anna Marie and today I thought that I would make a video reflecting on my year of reading in 2022 and then also kind of talk about some of my plans for 2023 while sort of doing that. It isn't currently 2023 yet, so I do have a couple more days, so I definitely might finish a few more books, which is why I'm not doing like a best books of 2022 yet, because I want to give some time, finish some more if I do or whatever. But I will tell you like the stats as of the 29th of December, which is when I'm filming this, because some of these things I don't think will change, at least not massively. So I read 77 books this year, and I would say I had an okay reading year. I have read some really great books, but I also do feel a bit like quite a few of the books I've read weren't as enjoyable as I wanted them to be or as I hoped they would be. And I did speak a bit about this, I think, in my mid-year book freak out tag. I do kind of feel like part of that was maybe because I was really trying to read my shelves, which meant I was reading books that I had like really wanted to read, 5 years ago. And I'm a different reader now than I was then. I'm a different reader now than I was at the beginning of the year, like things change a lot. And so it just meant that like, whilst I did enjoy things, I wasn't like necessarily massively loving them in the way that, sometimes I do. But I also, have had like a tough year. I mean, it's always tough, I guess, but like, I was living in various different places and I didn't know what my future would be like for a while. I think that has also impacted a lot of my reading, and I was working on PhD applications too at the beginning and way into like July or like June of this year. So again, I think that also really affected like my reading. And then I was starting a PhD, which also affected my reading, but maybe in a slightly different way. Let's see, I think I will go over some like numbers first, and then I'll talk about like maybe some themes and some other stuff too in terms of my reading. I read about 11 non-fiction books, which does include like poetry collections, and I think if you take out poetry collections, I read 8 non-fiction books, which isn't great. Like it's not terrible. I read about like 22 classics. I can't remember if I did include things. I think I included things published into the 1980s, but that's where I stopped. But I only read a couple things in the 1980s, so I would say like 22 classics is like around the number. Yeah, I don't really feel like that much about this number, but it's nice to know. I mean, I do like reading books written in the past, so it's nice to know I am dedicating a chunk of reading to that. I do feel like this year I did try to read longer books actually, and partially because I dislike how Storygraph says that I like books less than 300 pages, because I think that that's a silly category. Like I think it should be less than 250 pages, and then 250 plus to like 400 is one size, and then 400 plus is another, because there's a big difference between a 300 page book and a 250 page book. Like the vibe is so different, and same with like 300 and a 100 page book. Like seems really silly to lump those all together, but that's just me. But yeah, so I have, and it's also because I do enjoy big books, so I was sort of trying to do that. I haven't read a big book like I did War and Peace last year, but I have read, like maybe like 8 books that were 400 or so pages, which includes like Gideon the Ninth and The Group by Mary McCarthy. And I also have read 3 books that were over 500 pages. So that was The Pinhole Egg by Diana Wynne Jones, Harry the Ninth by Tamsin Muir, and The Memory of Babel by Christelle Dabo, translated by Hildegard Sahl. And then the largest books I read this year were Middlemarch, George Eliot, which this edition is 840 pages, so that's cool. And I also read Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy this year. I can't remember which translation I read of Anna Karenina, but it was about like 990 pages, so almost 1,000, and that is the longest book I read this year. Yeah, I definitely feel like I sort of intentionally read more translated fiction this year. I definitely also feel like that has been something I've been focusing more and more on as the years have gone by, like in the past 2 years. And I think overall I read about 15 translated books into English, and that about 12 of those were women in translation. And honestly, I think actually, like, normally almost all of them would have been. It's just this year I read like Anna Karenina, and I also read Madame Bovary, and I must have read another one, but I don't remember what that was, which, you know, I feel like isn't really something I'll be doing again. So yeah, I'm pretty happy with that, you know. I mean, it's something I want to keep going, and I do also want to keep kind of diversifying and reading from different areas in the world geographically, which at the moment I would say I have like quite a big European focus, and you know, I want to expand out of that more and more. I think I only read one book from South America. I do also try to and love to read languages that are not national languages, so Yiddish being one example, but also Orcadian, or the Orkney language, like from Deep Wheel Orcadia, although I didn't read that this year, but you know, that's an example. So, you know, languages that are minoritized, that are diasporic, I'm really interested in those. And I guess at the moment, like, my focus on those kinds of languages has been within Europe, but there are obviously languages like that across the world. And you know, sometimes that also kind of means that it's harder for me to access translations of them because they're already kind of minoritized language literary productions, and then to get them translated, they're even further marginalized because the translations are happening with like big languages and big names and big languages, I guess, from and into English. But, you know, hopefully more and more will be translated. Yeah, I don't know if that made any sense, but obviously also like a big part of my translated fiction intentional reading was my Yiddish Women in Translation project, where I wanted to read books translated from Yiddish written by women, and I kind of like was a bit wishy-washy with like what my aim was, so I said like 3 or 6, because, you know, I could read one every 2 months or I could read one every 4 months. In the end I actually read one per every 2 months for the first 6 months or so of the year, and then I didn't read any in the latter 6 months, and that's partially because I was moving, and also they're kind of difficult to track down. So I kind of did complete my goal because I did say 3, but I would have liked to get to 6, and now I do have 3 more. Well, actually, first I'll tell you what ones I read. So I read Diary of a Lonely Girl, or The Battle Against Free Love by Miriam Karpilov, translated by Jessica Curzane, and I read Judith, A Tale of Love and Woe, that was also by Miriam Karpilov and also translated by Jessica Curzane. And then I read a collection of stories by Yenta Mash called On the Landing, translated by Ellen Cassidy, I believe. So the first 2 of those I really enjoyed, and I thought they were great, and I'm excited to read more Miriam Karpilov. And the short story collection I had a lot of issues with, sort of from an ethical standpoint, I suppose. I really enjoyed the first part, which focused a lot on like Jewish women's experience of Soviet Moldova and being displaced, and, you know, life in the 1940s, and kind of creating new practices of Judaism in places of displacement. But I didn't like the latter half of that collection because almost all of the stories were set in Israel, and the way it normalized this kind of violence and the violence of settler colonialism I hated, in fact, and I disliked how the 2 parts sort of spoke to each other, but in a way that I think is really insidious. That hasn't put me off reading Yiddish. You know, I think Yiddish is a language that doesn't have one particular political stance, but it does, because it is diasporic, it does have the potential to be in like incredible solidarity with displaced and colonized people. Not that it always does, and I'm hoping that reading more Yiddish women I will find more that I really love. So I have 3 more books that I will read for this project, hopefully next year. I think I will say that I like to read these 3, and then, you know, through the year I'll kind of reflect and see what else is out there and what else I want to read, and whether I have space and time to do it, because I think it is more likely that I can only read 1 per every 4 months versus 1 per every 2 months in the next few years whilst I do a PhD. So I have another story collection. This is Found Treasures, Stories by Yiddish Women Writers, edited by Frieda Foreman, Ethel Raker, Sarah Silberstein-Schwartz, and Margie Wolf, with an introduction by Irina Klapfis, who's this great poet, lesbian poet. And I think this collection is from the 90s. Oh, and it has great pictures of everybody. Picture on the front is great, and it says in the page about like the data in the book, it says that the cover photograph is members of the Jewish Workers' Bund in Poland in 1908. So that's great, and they all look great. There's also actually a picture of Ida Mays, who is the person who wrote this other book that I have. It's not going to be great to see, but I believe she's the one in the middle. This collection doesn't seem, at least not from a quick glance, I can't seem to find any kind of notes about who translated what. There is like an introduction, so it might all be said out in there, but, you know, I haven't read it yet. So I will obviously say when I know. And yeah, so the next book I have is Dina, which is an autobiographical novel. Well, that's the name, and it's translated by Yamiyahu Aron Taub. And yeah, it looks really interesting. And I think it's a coming of age story about like Jewish life in Tsarist Russia. There's like a line on the back here that says it is a bit like reading Sholem Aleichem's Tevye stories, which is what Fiddler on the Roof is based on, from the viewpoint of the youngest daughter, which like obviously something I would be interested in. So yeah, also I really love this illustration on the cover, it's nice. And then the third one I have is Deborah by Esther Singer Kreitman. And yeah, this was translated by Maurice Carr. And yeah, this should be great. I did also see that in this there is also a singer from Esther Singer Kreitman in it, so there's, you know, clearly Ida Mays is writing in this as well, so it might be good to start with this one and then to read through the other two. Well, maybe I'll start reading this, dip in and out whilst I'm reading, because I feel like short story collections can be kind of difficult to get in the zone with. So those are the three main Yiddish women in translation books I want to read next year. I'm definitely always like on the lookout for recommendations though, so if you have any for me, please do let me know. I have my eye on a collection called Oedipus in Somewhere by Bloomy Lempel. Oedipus in Manhattan or something. That's, you know, also translated by Ellen Cassidy, I think, who translated Yenta Mash, and I think her translation seemed pretty good to me. So yeah, like that's all keeping going. I am really excited and enjoying it. I love learning about Yiddish, Judaism, Jewish and Yiddish women. I am on the lookout for other Jewish languages, so you know, Judeo-Espanol, Ladino, Haketia, but yeah, again, a lot of them are even more minoritized than Yiddish. They haven't in the same way experienced some of the spotlight and cultural focus that Yiddish has, so they are more hard to find, but I am, you know, would love to read something translated from Ladino. That would be really, really cool. And yeah, so the next kind of chunk of stuff I thought we should talk about is my TBR jar, and what happened there basically. So from January into May I made TBR jar challenge videos. That was where I picked 3 choices, or I got someone to pick 3 choices out of my TBR jar, and I tried to read at least 2 of them. I would say that I was successful in reading books from my TBR jar, and I was slightly less successful reading the TBR jar like choices, but I still do think I probably managed to read at least 1 of those choices, and then 2 books overall from my TBR jar, if that makes sense, like per month. I did basically stop doing this in August / maybe September. Maybe I did do it in August, I can't quite remember, but I stopped kind of doing videos about it in the same way, and part of that is because I moved, so I didn't have access to my books for a while, and then when I did, you know, I was moving, it was all it's kind of difficult, so I stopped doing that, but I did still continue to have like a focus on trying to read my TBR, and I do think I was like somewhat successful. I also did definitely buy way more books in the latter part of the year, which was a bit of a shame because I did quite a lot of good work at the beginning, but that was, you know, all part of the process of moving and getting excited and whatever. So I think overall I read about 26 books from my TBR jar that I had written down specifically. It wasn't my whole TBR that I had with me from January to May, or January to sort of August. It was just like a small selection, so I definitely percentage wise read like probably 20%, 30% of it, which I actually think is pretty good. You know, I would have loved to read more of it, but that's fine. And I did also end up like getting rid of quite a few of the books that I did read for that challenge, which is also nice. They can be shared with other people and enjoyed by other people than me. I will leave the playlist of the TBR jar challenge videos that I made if you're interested in seeing my progress as I was going. So in terms of out of the books I read, that's like a third of them, like 33%. So, you know, that's okay. Also in the latter part of the year I did have access to a library again, and I definitely read, like I felt like I really read like a lot more from the library than I had, which also affected how many books I was reading on my like backlist. Something I definitely noticed about my experience of doing a TBR jar is that it didn't really work for me to have non-fiction and fiction mashed up together. So I read about 8, like I said, this year. I think I would probably set my goal for non-fiction reading for 2023 to be about 6, because I will be reading a lot of non-fiction stuff. It just won't be necessarily book form, it will be articles and stuff like that, and a lot of it will have to be on my laptop screen, and like, you know, that takes a lot out of me reading wise. So yeah, I think reading 12 full books isn't going to work, but I do think I would like to. I made a new TBR jar yesterday and I did include the fiction and non-fiction, but I think what I will do is take out the non-fiction and do like a separate little smaller TBR jar, and every 2 months pick 2 out of it and then read one of them in those 2 months. Yeah, it just didn't really work when I would pick like 2 non-fiction books out of this, and also I just have to be much more in the mood specifically to read the non-fiction, and I just find it harder in general, so it seems silly to try to like basically overwhelm myself and try to force myself to read it. But it's also good to like know what I have and to sometimes like randomize the process of choice, because then suddenly you can read something and you're like, oh, you know, I didn't think I was in the mood for this, but actually this is really working right now, you know? So that is something that I learned from the TBR jar challenge. I did also learn that I could do something like that, so that's nice. Like, again, I don't think I necessarily was great at reading the specific choices in the specific months, but because I did manage to do it, I feel like pretty good about it. And I did, you know, read 2 per month the whole of the year, even when I wasn't actually actively picking out of my TBR jar. So yeah, I'm pretty happy with that. A gap in my reading this year that I feel kind of sad about is that I don't think I read a single one. I could have read like maybe one book from the 1920s. I did my 1930s reading vlog this year, and I also, which I guess I started it last year, but you know, finished it this year. And I also did another reading vlog, which was my 1880s reading vlog. So I was reading books from the 1880s, books from the 1930s. And I guess, yeah, I just sort of like didn't really have the space to pick up more 1920s books. And yeah, I made like a whole TBR too about like books from the 1920s I wanted to read, and then I didn't read any of them. So that's something I'm going to definitely focus on next year, because yeah, I have this like ongoing reading challenge for myself to read a book from every single year of the 1920s, and you know, some years are like massively oversaturated with books and I've read like 4 from 1928 or something, and others I haven't read a single book from, like 1920. Definitely the earlier years I've read way less from, but I do have ideas for I think every single year, so I should really get reading, you know. I really love it. And I mean, I think part of that is like my PhD idea kind of shifted away from the 1920s, although I still will maybe be working into the 1920s, but not, it's kind of the end of the parameters of my project rather than like the middle or the beginning, but it wasn't ever going to be the beginning. So yeah, that is something that I'm definitely going to try and do more of next year. I do actually have 2 non-fiction books that I am currently reading. I don't think I will finish both of them. I could maybe finish one of them before the end of the year, so that will mean I will have read about like 9 non-fiction books this year, so yeah. But that's The Subversive Stitch by Rosiska Parker, which yeah, I'm about 68 pages into. I've also got Lost in Work, Escaping Capitalism by Amelia Horgan, which I started in non-fiction November, and I'm 100 pages in, so I only have 65 or so pages left to go, so this is definitely doable. I did want to finish reading this, but I didn't want to carry it with me because it is quite heavy, so I don't think I will finish it this year, but soon I hopefully will. They're both good books, you know, it's not that they're bad, it's just, like I said, I struggle with reading non-fiction. I think that's enough talking. I've definitely talked a long time, and I hope this video isn't massively long. To kind of recap, my main themes of reading are I want to keep reading translated fiction, I want to keep reading my Yiddish women writers in translation, I want to read more books from the 1920s, or like read books at all from the 1920s. I want to keep reading large books. I'd like to read at least 6 non-fiction books, but I am going to be kind of lenient about it because of the PhD reading I have to do. Is that everything? I think that's kind of everything. I want to keep reading queer novels. I want to keep reading from different people and perspectives and places around the world, but all of these things, you know, it's not like I'd ever have a year of reading where I'd be like, well, I'm not going to do that anymore. And yeah, I mean, I do think I'm not setting like a number that I'd like to reach. I probably will like on Storygraph, because I like how it gives you kind of like a bit of a structure to know like your reading pace in a way. So I'll probably go for like 50, 55, it doesn't really matter. You know, again, partially because like I have no idea really how the rest of my PhD will affect my reading, and it probably will affect it quite a lot. So I wouldn't be that surprised if I'm finishing less books, even if I'm reading just as much or more than I read currently. And I think, you know, I will talk about books that I'm currently reading on my channel a bit more in wrap-ups and things. I'd like to keep reading classics, but again, some of that is just I need to read these books for from various eras for my research. So yeah, let me know what you think about my my year of reading, or if you had any thoughts about it, or if you have the experience of doing a TBR jar and like what you thought about it. Yeah, I really hope you have a lovely 2023. Oh, one thing I didn't say is that this year I tried to make a video every single week of the year, and I made more than that, but I also made so many that I got to 52 and there were like many weeks left of the year, and I didn't want to just stop posting, so I did this is the final week video, and so I did it. So that's really cool, and it was really tiring and it took a lot of effort, and I definitely won't be trying that project again this year. I mean, I'm still going to keep making videos and sharing my thoughts on books, but I won't be trying to do it like in such a time frame, because it was just a lot. It was just like an experiment to see if I can do it, and it looks like I could do it. But yeah, now I have like more of a structure to my life. Like it seems it's not sustainable for me to keep trying to do this, I think. But yeah, thank you so much for being here and for joining in and talking to me and commenting, and yeah, just being like kind and lovely and generous with your thoughts and your time. So yeah, bye.